Hey, thanks for joining me on my ride. This is a journal club on a bike covering the latest paper from Peter Strick's lab. Peter Strick is the head of my department of neurobiology at the School of Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. He's been working on the connections between the motor cortex and the muscles for at least 20 years. This guy was a scientist while I was still eating breakfast cereal and watching Saturday morning cartoons, and so he's got an H factor of about 80. He is one of the elder statesmen of neuroscience in America. This guy's lab is now moving in a new direction to look at the mind-body problem. This is simply stated, the connection between your mind and your body, and the fact that people who are in shape tend to be happier, people who are mindful tend to be happier, people who are with physically better posture tend to be happier. All of these things are sort of anecdotal, and lots of people were wondering whether the chicken comes first or the egg comes first in that scenario. And one of the things that's been missing from this puzzle is the anatomy, which supports this idea that the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, and the baseline level of stress that everyone experiences throughout their day is connected to physical well-being, the physical state, and also your mental state. And so what's missing there was this anatomy. What's connecting the higher order brain regions in the cerebral cortex to the adrenal medulla above the kidney. And so this is really the question that they ask with retrograde tracing using rabies virus. And this is a staple of their lab for many, many years, looking at connections from muscles to the motor cortex regions. And so doing this from the adrenal medulla mesquine maybe was a sort of a very obvious experiment for them to do, but it's 2020 and we're just doing it now. So I think it's a really neat paper which gives credence to the idea that there is concrete anatomy supporting these effects that trainers and mindfulness people and yoga people and all of these martial artists and everybody that knows that physicality is part of being, part of well-being, that they've all known for a very long time. This anatomy lends very much credence to that. So enjoy the paper, take a look at the figures, they're really interesting, and let it sort of spur you to explore this idea inside of your own self and wonder what things you can do better to connect your mind and body better and to elevate yourself to a higher state of well-being. Take care, hope you enjoy it, and if you liked it, like and subscribe. See you next time. Good afternoon, Pittsburgh and Universe. This is JC on a bike. My name is JC, and this is Journal Club on a bike. And today I want to cover a couple papers related to the anterior cingulate cortex. The cingulate cortex is involved in a lot of interesting processes in the brain. And in particular, I want to focus on the anatomy with regard to the anterior cingulate cortex. And I want to start off as a jumping off point with an anatomical rabies tracing paper in monkeys from Peter Strick's lab at the University of Pittsburgh. Peter Strick is an elder statesman of neuroscience with a H factor higher than 80 and a long-standing reputation for being one of the motor control Jedi masters of primate research. Definitely an elder statesman in neuroscience. He's been making contributions to our understanding of motor control in primates since I was a baby. And so Peter's lab has historically done a lot of work with rabies virus, and rabies virus is an interesting tool in neuroscience from the anatomical perspective, because what it does, the way that it leads to its lethal effects in animals and in people, is that it jumps transsynaptically. It jumps between connections between neurons from the periphery all the way to the brain. And on its way up to the brain, it destroys stuff. And so when you get bit by a dog and you get infected with rabies, the rabies virus enters your sensory nerves and your motor neurons, and it travels up through, jumping from one synapse to another, backwards through the circuit to eventually get up to your brain, where it can attack your breathing center or your, whatever that causes the advanced symptoms that lead to rabies death. So rabies virus has been used to trace connectivity in the nervous system transsynaptically by attaching a label to it, essentially, or another molecular tool that will allow you to follow the progress of the virus through the nervous system. And so Peter Strick's lab, one of his main bread and butter techniques for quite some time was to trace from peripheral muscle groups to the cortex, to the motor cortex, to places in the brain that subserve the control of those muscles. And this is how he's been doing research for years. Sorry. And so since the 80s or 90s, he's been doing this tracing from individual muscle grooves back to the cortex to see what cells are controlling these neurons. And then that's how they figure out where to stimulate when they're trying to study these things, right? And so rabies tracing is a very well understood technique. And interestingly enough, when you use it, it's a temporally dependent technique. And it used to be this way in the old days. I don't think they explain it in this paper so succinctly as this. But essentially, the longer you wait, if you look at figure 1, you keep labeling higher order neurons. So first you inject into the adrenal medulla, and then it traces back one step from the adrenal medulla to the sympathetic preganglion neurons in the spinal cord. Goes backwards to spinal interneurons, and then it goes backwards to the brainstem and hypothalamus. And if you keep waiting, then it goes to layer 5 of the cortex and to layer 4 of the cortex. And layer 5 is the known output layer of the cortex, so this is where we would expect the labeling. And so that's pretty cool how it works. So the question is, when you inject in the adrenal medulla above the kidney, where does this tracing lead you to? And so they follow it to the 4th order because they're interested in the cortical connections to the adrenal medulla. And so the cortical connections to the sympathetic effector. The sympathetic parasympathetic nervous system is this flight or fight nervous system. It's the nervous system that's thought to regulate your baseline amount of stress, and it's thought to be related to depression and anxiety and chronic stress. So, nothing like running a red light. So, when we are thinking about this, what we are trying to find out is what is the anatomical basis for the sort of psychosomatic disorders for psychosomatic illnesses, the anatomical substrate for psychosomatic illnesses. And this would seem to provide that. This paper would seem to trace and provide that. And that's what's interesting about it. So the first network that they find is the motor network. In the primate, this is generally considered to be 7 subregions of the motor network. And if you look carefully at figure 2, you can see that this projection is contralateral in origin, but there's a significant portion of this coming from the ipsilateral side, although a lot of the ipsilateral stuff is missing the M1 projections. It's more from the higher motor areas than M1. But the motor projection to the adrenal medulla is the largest of the three projections quantified in this paper. And so, interestingly, this projects to primarily maps to the trunk motor region of the body. So that would be posture, it would be core strength, core stability. And so it's an interesting anecdotal observation to say that people who do yoga or Pilates or planking as an exercise tend to have less stress and a lower baseline level of adrenaline. So this correlates well with that idea that the activation of M1 could have regulatory effects on the release at the adrenal medulla. So the question is how are these three networks interrelated with one another? But we're not going to address that in this paper. We're only addressing the anatomical basis for this connectivity. So the M1 and motor regions are the biggest projection, okay? And in the monkey, these are like 7 regions. And so, you know, naming these regions right now might not necessarily be that helpful for your understanding of things. But besides M1, there's dorsal and ventral premotor areas, there's supplementary motor areas, and there's ventral cingulate motor areas. And these cingulate motor areas are divisions functionally in the cingulate cortex, but you'll see clearly now when I reference the review and we talk about other things, the cingulate cortex is a pretty enigmatic part of the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex being this higher order executive functions area that has been interestingly ever divided into further subgroups as we've explored its functionality and tried to specifically split it into positive and negative aspects. And this would be like fear versus reward, positive reward, or something like that. But it's not ever been clear from any of these studies whether the distinction between, let's say, a negative affect and a positive affect center would exist. Some people have posited this. Most of the data doesn't suggest this. Most of the data suggests that the cingulate cortex is activated by both sides of this coin. And so although in this paper, and you'll see it in figure 6.2 with the colors that they are identifying 3 separate networks. The network that they call the cognitive network and the network that they call the affective network is likely an overlapping set of neuronal circuits that, albeit partially separate due to, you know, experiments in literature and pretense, I'm not necessarily sure that any of these divisions will stay hard and fast as neuroscience moves forward. But it is sufficient to say that these 2 affective and cognitive networks are quite a bit different than the motor network. Yeah, you're in a really bad place. That's why nobody can go by you. And she doesn't even notice or doesn't even care or something, I don't know. You got like 5 feet on this side, so whenever you're ready, it's amazing how bad the drivers are in Pennsylvania. They're really, really bad. So the anterior cingulate cortex in the rat is basically what they're talking about here. But interestingly, in this paper, they don't find those projections to the cingulate cortex in the rat when they try to do the similar tracing in a rat. And who knows why that is. You know, the monkey people will want you to believe that that's because the rat is not a good enough model for things like affect and cognitive, you know, regulation of attention and this kind of thing. But I'm not really sure that's the case. It's just that here in this tracing study, they don't find the same connectivity and the same organization of connectivity that they see in the larger monkey brain. So, take that with a grain of salt, but I mean, to say that rats and monkeys are different is not exactly a giant conclusion, right? So we can also just accept that as possible. So the affective network versus the cognitive network is really two parts of the cingulate cortex. In this paper, they talk about the affective network first, I believe, and then the cognitive network. It doesn't really matter. Both of them are portions of the frontal cortex, the medial frontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex is a distinct portion of that, huge medial prefrontal cortex, but it's, depending on who you talk to and what nomenclature you're using, they can be different or the same. One can be bigger or subpart of the other. But let's just say that the anterior cingulate cortex is this interesting frontal cortex that is involved in all kinds of what I consider to be very interesting aspects of fear and affect and emotional responses, and choosing the emotional response, choosing the setting the tone basically for determining how the animal will respond to a particular set of stimuli. And the anterior cingulate cortex, I think one example that I found that's really nice in the literature is an example, didn't even move over at all. One example that I found was a paper from 2010 where they looked at fMRI signals in the human, and they moved a tarantula closer and farther. No need to get upset. She said she was sorry. I think this paper is cool because it gives you kind of an idea of what the cingulate cortex might be doing, what some people think it's doing. What they do is they put these guys in an fMRI machine, and then they show them a picture of their foot and a box with different compartments in it that can be opened. And in one of these compartments is a large tarantula. And the tarantula is shown to be closer or farther away from their foot. And the subjects are asked to rate how afraid they will be if the spider is in one of the 5 boxes. And then after the spider is in one of 5 boxes, then they again rate it, how they feel. And they look at the fMRI signal, and they see that the first figure shows you a very interesting result, that the activity in the cingulate cortex ramps up as the threat becomes more imminent. So the closer the spider is, the more the cingulate cortex is signaling to be afraid. And so then I guess one prediction from this paper might be that there might be a semi-linear relationship between that baseline level of activation of the adrenal cortex and the proximity of the spider. And so anyway, what I'm trying to illustrate with this particular example that I'm citing is that the anterior cingulate cortex does something with higher processing of threats and reward, and it works together with the amygdala and the periaqueductal gray and the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis to sort of gauge the amount of impending danger and the appropriate amount of awareness of it, something like this. And so the connectivity with the adrenal medulla for this brain region is doubly interesting then, because in one hand it's about affect, in another hand it's about cognition and what's appropriate to pay attention to. And both of these parts of the cingulate cortex are connected to the adrenal gland, which is pretty seriously incredible from the perspective of all that we know about cingulate cortex. Another wonderful aspect of the cingulate cortex, it is the cortex that is activated by mindfulness training and by meditation.
And so you can imagine a scenario where there's a push-pull balance between aspects of the motor cortex, aspects of the cingulate cortex, that together with the rest of the frontal cortex kind of set your baseline mood. And exercise can increase your mood, mindfulness can increase your mood. And so the whole anatomical picture is very revealing, because it does lend credence to these observations that people who are in shape, people that work out, people that do yoga, people that spend a lot of times outdoors, people that plank, exercise is good for you, and it's good for your mood. It could reduce the amount of baseline stress through its interaction with the adrenal medulla. Now, in the rest of the figures, they're showing, what's going on with the rat versus the monkey. I think 3 is monkey versus human, so you can kind of see the equivalent brain regions that are activated. I think figure 4 then is rat versus monkey, the inputs from the cortex, and then figure 5 is something else. I gotta look at my list for a second and see if I wrote it there. Five is rat to kidney, that's right. So more downright look at the connectivity from the rat brain to the kidney. And there you see some frontal connections. There's no question that there's frontal connections there, they're just smaller, and so, it's hard to say what that's from. If that's just different because it's different or what. But there's definitely a frontal connection there. You want to say that it's not as large as in the monkey or not as extensive, that's fine. But I still am left sort of unsatisfied, because it's a very simple conclusion for monkey people to come through that, rats have less brain regions, less neurons, so some of these places just aren't there. I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm just saying that lots and lots of papers from the monkey make these conclusions, and then later on we find out that, well, it's not entirely true. The divisions in the rat are much harder to find because they're necessarily smaller networks, likely to be more intermingled and less easy to segregate by gyrus. I mean, even that, I'm sure, is a large artifact of the anatomy of the human brain and the primate brain, that you have gyri to look at, and so the anatomical landmarks are handier. It's much easier to justify subdivisions when there are landmarks to go by. And so if the ACC in a rat is divided, it just doesn't have as many anatomical landmarks from which to make obvious divisions. That's what I think, but I don't know. But I really like this paper because it gives you a cognitive to physical link that can explain why I like to bike to work, and it can explain why yoga is awesome, and it can explain why Tai Chi is awesome, for example. Tai Chi is not considered to be some ultra strenuous thing in general, but it's movement. It's very conscious, cognitively aware movement, you see? And that means that in general, and I think this is where you can jump to, is that playing an instrument engages all of these networks. It's something they don't really mention in this paper, but it's most definitely true. And probably other things too. Not just exercise, but let's say playing in a game where there's goals to be scored, so that there's more positive and negative affect and active monitoring of outcomes. Again, you're going to be activating all three of these regions. And so it could just be the lack of activation in these regions that leads to chronic stress. Who knows? Lack of exercise, lack of mindfulness.